Howdy, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Fort Worth Property Management Podcast. I am Mason, your host. I am here with First Choice Property Management in Fort Worth, Texas. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most important and often overlooked decisions that you as a landlord have to make throughout the entire life cycle of the lease. So the topic of discussion today is going to be, should I renew to this tenant, or should I move on and find a new one? A lot of landlords end up overlooking how important this decision is and overlooking how important the entire process of renewal is. And to be quite frank, the reason that they overlook this is because they're lazy. It's so much easier just to say, well, they're paying rent, let's just leave them in there. So today's episode, we're going to talk about how to avoid that and how to set yourself up for success over a long period of time through the renewal process. And so it's going to be a jam-packed episode. We're excited to jump into it today. Let's get started. So for a lot of landlords, the highest stress point throughout the lease is finding that next tenant. There's a lot of stress behind the leasing process because there's strain from a few different areas. The two main areas I can think of are a financial strain. There's vacancy. There's nobody paying rent. You had to just pay to do a make ready and turn the home. And so there's a big financial strain whenever you're having to find a new tenant to live in the property. The second half of that is stress from the unknown, stress of the person who's going to be living in the house, right? You're trying out a new tenant for the first time. You're going to have to screen them, and it can be stressful to trust a person to live in your biggest performing asset, right? And so that is often looked at as one of the highest stressed point in the leasing cycle. And so over time, when the tenant ends up working out, we get very complacent. And now that money is coming in, the biggest strain, the financial aspect of it, is now alleviated. We have no more strain. There's still a little bit of nerves, right, if they're going to pay rent or not. But for the most part, rent is coming in every month, so you don't have to worry anymore. The mortgage is covered, or you're having your income that's coming in. And so this is where a lot of landlords will get lazy on the back end. So fast forward 10 months from when you place the tenant, their lease is coming up for renewal, and you have to make a decision. Should I renew to the tenant or should I not renew? And the reason I say that a lot of landlords will end up getting lazy is because of the financial aspect. Is because right now, at this moment in time, they are paying rent on the first, and it's coming in, and you don't have to worry about it. So it's a lot easier to just leave them in the house. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of landlords can mess up, because while it makes financial sense for them to stay in the property now, you could be setting yourself up for failure later on after they move out of the property. So it's very important that you consider more than just the immediate monthly payment. It's a big decision. We want you to take it seriously, and a lot of landlords just make the decision based on convenience. Hey, they're paying rent, let's just keep them. Right? So today, we're going to walk you through the entire renewal process so you can learn how to make this decision like a professional. We're going to break down the risks of renewing versus non-renewing. We're going to go through a step-by-step framework of how exactly we decide if a tenant should be renewed to or not, and all the factors we look at. And then we're going to give you a few things to look at in the overall tenant experience so that you can make the decision like an asset manager, not just like an everyday landlord. So stick around. We're excited to jump in today's episode. Before we get to that, we are going to kick it off with our segment called Behind Closed Doors. It is a segment where I give you a little look into what's happening here at First Choice Property Management in the Fort Worth rental market. Right now, First Choice Property Management is managing 535 properties in the greater Fort Worth area. Over the last few weeks with our team, we've implemented a lot of new KPIs where we're able to track renewals, leases, and a lot more things that impact our day-to-day company. And we want to look at that because if we are renewing to tenants, we want to make sure that the properties are being taken care of, and we want to make sure that the tenant experience is great enough so that they want to renew for longer. You have to take that into account too, because as a property management company, we've realized we are a customer service based company for both owners and tenants. On the tenant side, if you're not good at customer service and you don't give them a good experience, they're going to leave. And that is not good for your homeowners who are your partners. And so it's important that you're able to keep both sides happy, of course, while still defending our owners and being on our owners' side. So we are fully in the midst of spring here in Fort Worth. We're seeing a lot of homes hit the market and a slight increase in the amount of owners who are reaching out to rent their properties. Pair that with everybody in the market knows that spring and summertime is the peak season for real estate. So you're seeing a slight bump in the average rental price here in Fort Worth. People aren't used to the inventory levels that we have right now. The inventory of rental properties has doubled over the last 2 years. And so it's going to be interesting to see this summer if those properties with higher rents end up successfully renting at those prices, or if they sit a little bit longer and have to decrease to the standard market rate. First Choice also has been one of the first companies in the area to implement AI into our day-to-day operations. Now, of course, everybody's using ChatGPT, everybody's using, these large language models to almost like a new Google or something like that. But also other ways that we're implementing it is using it in our phone system so that you can actually talk and interact with somebody who can give you information. It is also used in our self-showings. So when a tenant prospect wants to view a property, it is perceived like they're texting somebody on our team, and this AI program is viewed as another team member that we have. And so we're on top of it. We're learning how to better it for our owners and just making sure that we do our best to keep up with how much AI is changing each year. Every month at this point. So we'll continue to implement it to where it is bettering our experience for both owners and tenants, and not just an endless loop of like a chat box that you can't get a hold of somebody, because we all know how that goes. So those are some things that we're working on over the next few months. It is going to be less project-based and more operations-based because we are gearing up for summertime. It's going to be a busy summer. We're excited. We're already seeing it. We're already seeing applications fly through. With summers being the peak season, this also means that all the tenants who moved in last summer and the summer before that and the summer before that, they're all coming up for renewal. And so what property managers will start doing is assessing each property, assessing the market rate, look at what new homes are renting for in the area, and then making that big decision. Should we renew to the tenant or not? The main question they ask during this time is the tenant helping or hurting the long-term performance of this property? It's a great question to ask yourself, because with long-term rentals, we are looking at the overall long-term performance. Long-term rentals is not just a cash flow play. You do have to think about this property's longevity, because as we know, one vacancy, one tenant turnover, one big expense, that all cash flow goes out the door. And so that's the question that we use to help determine if we should renew it to the tenant or not. Is this tenant helping or hurting the long-term performance of the property? And that's exactly what we're going to break down today. To get all cards on the table here, we're going to start out with the pros and cons of renewing versus not renewing. Because as a landlord, you're thinking right now, I'm not getting lazy. It's just way easier to leave a tenant in there, or it wasn't that bad over the last year. I just want to leave them in. And so to talk through the pros and cons of both sides, I want you to know that I understand. I see every aspect. I know what the cons are of not renewing. I know that vacancy hurts big time. Risk on both sides of this decision. There's no 100% safe choice. It's just better or worse decisions based on the given situation. So let's start with renewing to the tenant. You decide to let them stay in the property for another year, and you want to renew to that same renter for another 12 months. Some of the pros of renewing is, the number one thing that I think of is you avoid vacancy. The house stays occupied. There's no lost rent, no downtime where the house is sitting empty, where you have to turn on the utilities, stuff like that. That's a big one. That is probably the number one pro of renewing to a renter. That's the reason that it's so easy to just say, oh, they're paying rent, just leave them in there, right? Another pro is you avoid the turnover cost, the cleanings, the repairs, the fee that you pay to the realtor to release the place, the touch-up paint, the utility costs while it's vacant, right? Like all those turnover costs, they add up every year and nobody wants to do them. And so it is a pro to leave them in there save on those costs. A big pro to renewing that is often forgotten about is just you get predictability. You know these people now. You're not starting off fresh. There's less risk of not knowing who's going to move into the house. You know their habits. You've talked with them. You've met them. You're just a bit more comfortable now. And so there's less uncertainty with just leaving them in the home. And now for the flip side of that, let's talk about the cons of renewing. Because yes, renewal is great, but there are some cons. There are some bad sides to renewing. And it really comes down to the person that you're renewing to and the property. One of the cons can be that if you renew to somebody, you could be keeping a problem for another year. Like if they consistently pay rent late, they end up paying, so you're happy, but they consistently pay rent late. That can be a problem that you're keeping. Maybe they're not taking great care of the property. It's a little bit dirtier than you thought. They ended up getting a puppy for Christmas for their child and you didn't know about it. Those smaller things, they tend to add up over time. So you could be renewing and just keeping a problem that is going to continue to compound the longer that they stay. Now, the few things that I list during these cons, I'm not saying that it's an automatic non-renewal if they happen, but they are cons that can continue to grow over time. You might also miss the opportunity to raise rents enough to keep up with the market. Keep in mind, just a year or two ago, you're going to have screened these people. You're going to know their income. And if the market jumps or if houses in your area start renting for a lot more, it's a lot harder to raise rents for a tenant by $150 to $200 because for the last year, they've been paying X number, and now they have to pay something $200 higher. That stinks. And a tenant who's fresh, who's excited to move to the area, and they see your property listed at that higher number, they may be more willing to pay that because they're not anchored to the original rent price like a tenant who's lived there for a year would be. Or even whenever you go to raise the rents by that much, they negotiate with you and they say, hey, come on, man, let's leave it at this, or they give you an excuse, and you end up just saying it's easier to just leave the rent closer towards the original rent price and keep them in the house. And so the longer that happens, the longer that you continue not to raise rent, the further away you get from your market rent. And so you can potentially end up losing out on a little bit of money. And then, of course, a big con of renewing to a tenant is that a mediocre tenant can end up costing you more money over the long term than a quick turnover would. So let me give you an example real quick. If a tenant lives there for a year and you get signs that they're not taking care of the property, you move them out after year one, the turnover costs, yes, you are going to be hit with them at that time, but a touch-up paint to fix whatever happened over that year is going to be significantly cheaper than allowing that renter to stay there for 2 or 3 years and compound on that problem. Because the longer they live there, the more work that's going to be needed to get the house back into its original shape, and you're only going to have the same security deposit for those 3 years. Sometimes it seems like it's going to cost you more money if a tenant moves out sooner, but in the long term, and a lot of real estate investors will back me up on this, in the long term, that money doesn't compare to a tenant who slowly trashes a place over the course of 3 years, because then you have to pay an absorbent amount of money to get the house back into good shape so you can find a better renter next time around. Okay, great. So now let's flip completely. We got pros and cons of renewing. Let's flip to non-renewing. We're going to start with the pros of non-renewing. Yes, there are some. Trust me. We've seen it all here. There are some pros of non-renewing. So the first thing is that you get to reset the property. You get to clean it, you get to fix it, and potentially you get to improve it. So, of course, it is based on every property, but the really good thing is that when you reset a property, you know the condition. You document the condition, and now the next renter is obligated to return you the property in that better condition. And then if you improve it, it typically leads to higher rents, quicker tenants, and lower vacancy. And so there are some pros, especially if you've been renewing year after year after year. It'll be good to get that property back into shape and looking good again, be able to raise rents for the next tenant. Once you improve that property, or if a long-term tenant moves out, when you go to relist the property, you can bring it up to market rent. So you potentially could see a few $100 spike in what you've been getting every month just because the previous tenant decided to move out, and now you can catch up with the market. A pro of non-renewing to a bad tenant is that you have the opportunity to place a stronger one. And when I say stronger, I mean one that qualifies a little bit better, one that takes care of the house, one that may pay rent on the first like clockwork every single month. And then with that previous tenant, you probably saw them start to trend downward. So you will reduce your long-term risk significantly just by placing a little bit better of a tenant. So if one tenant starts trending downward, it'll be good to put a tenant in there who's going to take care of the property consistently over time. And then let's flip it over to cons. Of course, there are cons to non-renewing. So a con to non-renewing is that you will have some vacancy. You need to have some type of nest egg or emergency fund for vacancy, because while that house is empty, there's not going to be any rental income for that time. So if you have a mortgage, if you have taxes or insurance, that will need to be covered during those times of vacancy. And we all understand even a few weeks without rent starts to add up, especially the interest rates that we've been getting over the last 3 or 4 years. Your average mortgage here in DFW right now is about $2,300. So a few weeks without a renter, it can cost you $1,500. So that starts to add up very quick. And that's just for having an empty house. It doesn't even take into account for the second con, which is your turnover cost. You're going to have to get the house cleaned. You're going to have to do some touch-up paint, possibly replace the carpets or freshen up the flower bed, right? There are a bunch of stuff that you have to do to get the house ready to go for the next renter. Of course, a lot of that is deductible from a security deposit as long as the house was in good shape beforehand. But you will have turnover costs. It's inevitable. It happens during every turnover when a tenant leaves and a new one moves in. And then one more con is that there is always risk with a new tenant because you don't know them yet. Most property management companies do a great job of screening renters and finding any reasons why you may not want to rent to them. Your everyday landlord may not be as good at doing that. And so there is always risk when signing a lease with a new tenant because you don't know them yet. You don't have any experience with them. You haven't been talking with them multiple times over the last year. And so there's that risk. There's a little bit of uncertainty with the next tenant that can move in. Of course, we hope it goes incredibly. We hope we find the best tenant in the world, but it could also go the other way. And so there's a little bit of uncertainty there in that time as well. So all those pros and all those cons put together, considering it all, really what it comes down to is which decision creates the best long-term outcome for my property. That's what you want to determine. And so we're going to talk about how exactly to figure that out and how to have that gut feeling on what is right and what is wrong when renewing to a tenant. So obviously, as you can tell from the tone over this first few minutes of the podcast, not every paying tenant is a good tenant. Just because somebody pays rent doesn't mean that they're a strong long-term fit. You want to know what else to identify that could be giving hints that they may not be a good fit for the long term. And so instead of asking, are they paying rent every month? You should start asking, how are they performing as a tenant? Okay, so ask yourself that. Here at First Choice, we evaluate a few different areas when deciding whether we should renew to the tenant or not. We evaluate the condition of the property, their payment performance, maintenance behavior, and then the overall experience with them as a renter. So we're going to walk through each one, and then this will also give you kind of a step-by-step guide on what to do in the last 2 to 3 months of their lease. Okay? The first step that you're going to do, and in my opinion, the most important part of this entire renewal process, is you're going to walk the property. Here at First Choice, we begin this process 60 to 75 days before the tenant's lease ends. So if your lease ends on May 31st, this process is going to be starting at the end of March or beginning of April. And so right now in April, our property managers are walking through properties that come up for renewal in May and June. This is by far the most important part, so do not skip this. If you're out of town, you need to drive into town to see the house. You need to get a walkthrough video from the tenant. You need to have a family member or friend go walk the property, but it is so important. You cannot assume that everything is fine. So much can happen in 10 months living in a house. I mean, shoot, I don't clean my room for 2 weeks and it's disgusting. So, can you imagine an entire house, a whole family living in a place, And so, it's so important. You got to go see this. You got to go see the property. You need to physically see how the tenant has been living. This is going to be your biggest resource when determining whether or not you should renew to the tenant. This will be the slap in the face that you need to tell you no. Right? Because this is what's going to help you get that gut feeling that just something isn't right. And so you need to go walk the property. What we do is that 60 to 75 day window beforehand, we reach out to the tenant. We say, hello, Mr. or Mrs. Tenant, it is time for your annual occupied viewing. We're going to come in and walk the property, document the condition, and take a bunch of pictures. And we'll be out of your hair in about 20, 30 minutes tops. Okay? And when you walk the property, you're going to look for cleanliness. You're going to look for any damages beyond normal wear and tear. You're going to look for any lease violations like unauthorized pets, people living there who shouldn't be there, too many vehicles, stuff like that. And then you're going to look at the general care of the home. Some items to look for and not to look for. Items to look for is paint damage that's beyond normal wear and tear. If you see some slight wear marks around the light switches, that is completely fine. But if you see just writing on the walls, their kid used crayon on the walls, if they painted one of the rooms, you need to be looking for things like that. You need to see how it smells. Is it clean in there? Did they pick up before you walk through? Are they hiding a puppy that they didn't tell you about? You can determine a lot of that through smell by just walking the property. You can't do that through a video. And then you want to make sure to check under the sinks to see if there were any leaks or anything that they didn't tell you about. Check the AC filters, make sure that they've been changed. Kind of identify how they clean up. They're just cleanliness overall. Because here's the thing. How a tenant lives in that home is going to be how they leave it to you. Actually, how they live in the home is going to be better than how they leave it to you. Okay? And so if they're living pretty rough, if it's dirty in there, if it's dingy, if it stinks, just wait until they don't care because you're not renewing to them. Those last 30 days, they're really not going to care how they leave the house. And so you need to make sure that that environment that you're walking to is well taken care of, that it is clean, that they are caring for the property, they are changing the AC filters, and they are cleaning the house. A clean, well-maintained home is a strong indicator of a good tenant. A messy, dirty, neglected home is a warning sign. If the lawn has gone out of whack way too long, if the AC filter hasn't been touched since they moved in, that's a bad sign. There's a lot of red flags going off. So you definitely want to pay attention to that. That is going to be your step one in determining if you should renew to them, because it could very well be that regardless of anything else we talked through today, if you walk through that property and it just is in terrible shape, it's an auto no. It is an automatic non-renewal. You need to get them out of that house, okay? And so that is the most important part of the renewal process. The next thing that you want to look at, you almost want to give them a grade over the past year, specifically on their rent payment performance. I like to think of it in terms of their on-time payment percentage. So typically, the first of the month rent is due, right? So a few things to consider. Are they paying before the due date? Like, are they budgeting ahead of time and setting aside your rent payment at the end of the month so that it's paid on time? Great, that's a good sign. Are they paying on the due date? Like clockwork, does it come in at 8 a.m., automatic bank transfer that's set up every month on the 1st? Great. Are they paying during the grace period? Sometimes you have a grace period to where you can still be on time on the 3rd or 4th of the month. Are they paying then? Okay, it's getting in on time. They're slightly off from the 1st of the month, but it's getting here. And then, are they paying late? Are they always late? Or have they only been late around Christmas time or during the holidays, right? Like, how often are they late? You want to grade that on a percentage basis. So have they been on time 90% of the time? Something like that, right? You want to look at that and identify their trends. Because a great tenant is very consistent. So regardless of if they pay before the due date, on the due date, or during the grace period, if they're consistently doing that, that's a great sign. That means they're budgeting for it. They're setting aside the money. They might even have an automatic bank transfer set up, which is really great. And then a risky tenant is inconsistent. If you're having to text them to remind them about rent when it comes around on the 1st. If some days it comes in on the 7th of the month, or only one time throughout the year did they pay on the 1st, you want to pick up on those signs, because one thing that I see countless and countless times is that as they're consistent and they start paying later and later, eventually they're going to lap themselves. They're going to pay rent late in 1 month, so they're going to pay on the 5th, and then the next month they're going to pay a little later on the 10th, and then the next month they pay a little later on the 15th, and now they paid you on the 15th. Well, they're not going to get another good paycheck by the time rent's due, so now they're going to pay rent again on the 15th or 16th, and then it keeps going until now they're 1 whole month behind, and there's no catching up from that. Right? It's hard to make 2 rent payments like that. And so the key is consistency and the on-time percentage, how often they're paying rent on time. And if you are still on the fence about renewing, and I want to say if you're on the fence of renewing for rent payment performance right here, then you need to tighten your guardrails, because when you give a tenant an inch, they will take a mile. If you let them pay rent free 1 month, they're going to continue to get worse and worse over time, eventually to where they don't pay. And so we don't want you to go without rent payments or run into an eviction situation. Rent payment performance is very important. We always are willing to have grace with tenants. We understand people lose their jobs. We understand the holidays get tight. So always have grace with your tenants. They are human beings as well. But when it's consistent enough over the course of a year, it gets a little bit tough. Okay, so of course, look at their rental payments and then make a good decision for the long-term performance of this property. Next, we're going to identify something that's a little bit different, but is an important factor in the overall lease cycle, and it's going to be their maintenance behavior. So let's talk about maintenance. Maintenance is typically one of those factors that is overlooked during the renewal time. It's important that we look at a few different things. The first thing is the number of work orders submitted. So when looking at the tenant's previous maintenance requests, you want to look at how many work orders that were actually submitted, what those requests were, and whether the damage was tenant caused. Like if they are submitting work order after work order because they continue to hurt the home, they can't be good. Right? But we've also run into the situation where a tenant moves in and they tend to over-submit work orders. What I mean by that is they're submitting work orders for simple things that are not necessarily the landlord's responsibility to do, like changing the air filters, like replacing a light bulb in the ceiling fan whenever it goes out, because they're renting the house, right? They feel slightly entitled that the homeowner should be taking care of absolutely everything in the house for them, and that's a red flag, because then they feel like they have no responsibility to maintain this house, and that would not be good. So you do want to look at all of those requests, and then you also want to look at when they were reported. So a good tenant is going to report issues early, give you a heads up, and then they're going to make the request reasonable. They're going to work with the vendor. They're going to work with you. They're going to work with the handyman who comes in, right? All those things. They're going to be reasonable, and they're going to be ahead of time. A bad tenant or a problem tenant is going to submit constant minor complaints. Submit a work order, but it's really a complaint. They're complaining about something like, I moved in and I didn't realize that my utility room is too small. Well, you can't do anything about that. You accepted the house like that, right? A problem tenant causes frequent damage to the house, and then a problem tenant will neglect telling you about something for a long period of time. So somebody who has a leak under their sink, they realize it, but they don't tell you about it long enough to where it actually leaks to the floor and ruins some of the floor as well. That could have been avoided if they would have cleaned it up, if they would have turned off the water under the sink, or even if they would have just notified you before the fact. And so it's very important to take maintenance into consideration here, because these are going to be the people who are continuing to submit these requests or damaging the property if they're continuously having to submit work orders because they damaged it. The most common example is with kids. If they're continually putting stuff down the garbage disposal, down the sinks, hair down the sinks, clogging up the toilet with different debris, right? So those can be things that you want to look at as well. And then this can also be, like I mentioned before, is that you can be renewing to a headache or to a bigger problem. And this is where this can come into play. If you're getting a work order once a week, that is not what landlording should be. It should not be that there's some type of work that has to happen once a week. Again, proceed cautiously. If it's a renter who's given you so much headache about certain things on a property, it may be best to move on from them. Okay, and so this last one is going to be the overall tenant experience. You want to identify how your experience has been with them over the last year. Now, it's going to be so much easier to do with each individual tenant. In your mind, you're probably already feeling it now, but this is the big picture. Okay, you want to ask yourself things like, are they easy to communicate with? Do they follow the lease? Are they respectful to me, to my vendors? Just, are they respectful in general? Are they considerate? Are they considerate whenever we need to come in and do an AC tune-up in the spring? You want to look at the past year, re-identify if you're comfortable with all the given knowledge that you have now, if you're comfortable letting them live in the property again for a year. Because the last thing you want is to put added stress on you because of this tenant for the convenience of a monthly rental payment. Some tenants, the experience with them is bad enough that you should want to move on, get the house empty, and find a new tenant. And that'll be pretty clear-coded. But you also want to identify those other things that might be sticking out that you might not want to deal with anymore. Like, do you have to chase them every month for rent? Do you have to send them that monthly reminder? Look how the lease went over the last 10 months to a year, and based on that experience, are you comfortable giving them access to your biggest performing asset? They are directly impacting how your biggest asset performs over the course of a year, right? And so you want to look at that in a big picture after you've taken into consideration the condition and you've walked the property, after you've looked at how they've paid rent, and then after you've looked at how they've handled maintenance over the last year, and then your overall experience with them as a renter. Pair those 4 items together and make your decision. Should you renew to the renter, or should you move on and look for the next person who's going to move into the property? It's hard. A lot of it is a gut feeling that you go with. Again, I'm telling you, landlords go with convenience. They'd rather take the monthly rental payment, and we don't want you to fail over time. We don't want this to cost you a lot more money than it needs to. So when you should renew to a tenant who pays rent on time consistently, even one who has a monthly bank transfer set up, right? It just automatically happens. So they pay rent on time consistently. They've kept the property in great condition, has minimal or reasonable maintenance requests. If the AC goes out and they submit a request for that, that's reasonable. It's not going to be a minimal replacement, but it is very reasonable. It's needed, right? So, has minimal or reasonable maintenance requests, communicates well, and follows the lease. That is a top of the line, top tier, tier 1 tenant that you want to renew to, that I personally would renew to every single time. A great tenant is worth keeping. Even if you don't maximize rents, even if you're not raising their rent every year, that good tenant who's going to take care of the property and pay rent on time every month, they're worth keeping. Okay? And then when not to renew, you should consider not renewing to the renter whenever you have multiple repeated late payments or whenever you have to chase them down for rent every single month. If when you walked the property, it was in very poor condition, if they're not taking care of the house, if there's significantly more wear on a property than should have happened over the course of 10 months, you probably don't want to. If you have excessive maintenance issues, like if they're putting way too many work orders in for things you could never fix, or for items that are not realistic maintenance requests, if they have multiple lease violations, if they have pets that aren't supposed to be there, if they have 20 cars out front, these are all lease violations. And then if they have difficult communication. If a majority of those things are happening, you need to consider not renewing and starting over. Reset the property, find a new tenant who's going to give you a better experience, who's going to pay rent on time, and who will lower your stress levels for the next year. So there's an easy way to simplify it. Ask yourself, knowing what I know now, would I rent to this tenant again? If I had another property on the other side of town and they wanted to move to that one, would I rent to them? Would I give a landlord a good, confident recommendation for this tenant to move into their rental property? And then, of course, are they helping or hurting my investment? You need to realize that if over 1 year they're hurting the property and damaging it, then it's just going to compound and compound over the next year or two. And then if you take all those questions into consideration when making your decision, that'll usually give you your answer. It'll stick out very clearly with your answer on what you should do. And a lot of times, if they're great tenants, it is so clear. It is so clear that you want to renew to them. And I'll be completely honest, the walkthrough of the property will give you more clarity than any other of these steps. If you skip the walkthrough, it's going to be so easy for you to renew and not even know any of this. It's going to be so easy to renew and not even think about getting them out. But if you walk the property and you see that they're not taking care of it, you're going to have a decision to make. And we want you to make the right one. So that is why we help build this framework for you and build this entire process so that you're not stuck after 2 years having to do another $20,000 remodel on the house. And so here at First Choice, we do have a checklist of items to look for when renewing to a tenant. We do help with lease renewals if you need to. And then I am more than happy to get on the phone with you and talk about each individual situation and give you advice on if you should renew to your tenant or not. So please do not hesitate to reach out to me. My phone number is very accessible on our website at fortworthpropertymanagement.com. And then my email is mason@firstchoicepm.com. That's mason@1stchoicepm.com. And I will leave you with this. The best landlords do not just manage the tenants. They manage their assets and put the best possible person in that house to make sure that is taken care of long term. And so if you want help evaluating your current tenant situation, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And if you want a PDF of exactly our step-by-step process on what we go through to determine if we should renew to the tenant, just reach out to me at fortworthpropertymanagement.com. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. If there's anything you want to see in the future, please leave a comment below. Subscribe to the show. Consider leaving us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And then make sure you turn on notifications so you are notified every time we post a new episode here on our channel. We're so thankful for each and every one of you tuning in. I am your host, Mason Arispe, here at First Choice Property Management. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We'll see you next episode. Have a good rest of your day.